How would you deal with the guilt you carry if you discovered it was never yours to begin with? Christmas lights flickered frantically on the bakery's small sign as Charlotte Moore cleaned the already spotless counter for the third time. The morning's movement had been slow, and the cold wind that came in each time the door opened seemed more threatening than inviting. She sighed, adjusting the ribbon holding her apron together as she watched the snow pile up on the front steps. All she wanted was to pay the bills and survive until the new year. But the numbers in the expense notebook that rested on the counter insisted on contradicting her. The shrill sound of the doorbell echoed, and a man hurried in, shaking the snow off his expensive woolen coat. He looked out of place in the cozy atmosphere of the bakery, with his perfectly tailored suit and slightly irritated expression. Charlotte didn't need to look twice to know he wasn't the kind of customer who showed up there by accident. "I need coffee. Strong," he said, without even looking up at her. She raised her eyebrows, forcing a friendly smile. "Good morning to you too. Strong coffee, of course. We have a delicious Christmas mix that can warm even the coldest heart." The man finally looked at her, his blue eyes shining with impatience. "I'm not here for a commercial. Just coffee, black." As Charlotte turned to prepare the order, she couldn't help but make a light comment. "It's always good to remind people that Christmas is about warmth, you know." He let out a short, dry laugh. "Of course, Christmas. The perfect time to spend money on things we don't need, while ignoring what really matters." Charlotte handed over the coffee, unable to hide her displeasure. It was clear that this man had problems with the date, but what bothered her most was the way he reduced something so important to her. "It's $1.50, she said. The man took a 20 out of his pocket and placed it on the counter. "Keep your change," he said, already walking towards the exit. "Thank you for your generosity," Charlotte replied sarcastically, watching as he disappeared out the door. She took the note and put it in the register, determined not to let a surly customer ruin her day. The next day, Ethan Carter got out of his limousine in front of the glass building that housed his company's headquarters. The snow didn't seem to bother him, but the Christmas spirit that permeated every corner of the city irritated him deeply. The illuminated trees and incessant music in the streets seemed to mock everything he had lost years ago. Inside his spotless office, Ethan ignored the Christmas cards his assistant had organized on his desk. Instead, he slumped in his chair, staring at the email he had received from his father that morning. "Bring a date to the company Christmas dinner. Your public image needs a human touch, Ethan. Don't let me down." The word disappoint echoed in his mind like a hammer. He closed the laptop with a heavy sigh. The last thing he needed was yet another family charge. That night, as Charlotte closes the bakery and Ethan leaves his last meeting, their lives begin to move toward an unexpected encounter. Guided by the twinkling lights of Chicago and the secrets they both carry, even though they don't yet know it. Charlotte fought the biting wind as she loaded the last bag of flour into the antique car parked next to the bakery. The sign kept flashing, almost like a reminder that even the magic of Christmas needed constant maintenance. When she finally got into the car, her hands shaking from the cold, she opened the crumpled envelope she had received that morning. The ink seemed blacker against the white paper, and every word seemed to scream at her. Final notification. Payment late. Property will be recovered within 30 days if amounts are not paid. Tears burned Charlotte's eyes as she read and reread the words. The building that housed the bakery was all that was left of his parents, their inheritance, and their dream. Losing him would be like losing the last part of them that was still alive. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if she could control destiny with just the strength of her determination. But the truth was cruel. The numbers didn't lie, and she knew she was losing the battle. At the same time, Ethan Carter was in a completely different scenario, but with a similar weight on his shoulders. Christmas dinner was approaching, and his family kept sending him messages reminding him of the importance of keeping up appearances. He was walking through the ballroom of a charity event, a space decorated with bright lights and impeccably decorated Christmas trees. But everything seemed overly artificial to him. The murmur of the people around him sounded distant, until his stepmother's voice broke into his thoughts. "Have you already chosen who you're going to take to dinner?" Ethan turned around, maintaining his trademark cool expression. "No, I don't have time for that." She narrowed her eyes, assessing him as if he were an incompetent employee. "You know how important this is, Ethan. Your image is what sustains our company. Showing that you have someone by your side will strengthen our position in the market." He gritted his teeth, feeling his blood boil. It was always like this. His personal life reduced to a tool for profit and reputation. He mumbled something about getting it over with quickly and walked away, grabbing a glass of wine to hide in a darker corner. It was then that he remembered the woman in the bakery. There was something about her witty response, something that challenged him in a way he wasn't used to. He had never paid attention to someone like her, but now the idea seemed convenient. Maybe she was the solution to his problem. The next morning, Charlotte was rearranging the Christmas sweets in the window when she heard the sound of the doorbell. When he looked up, he saw Ethan Carter standing there, his hands in the pockets of his expensive coat, looking out of place but determined. She set the tray aside, crossing her arms. "Look who's back. Have you decided to indulge in the Christmas spirit?" Ethan took a deep breath, as if he needed to gather his courage for what he was about to say. "Not exactly. I need to talk to you." The serious tone in his voice disarmed her. She nodded and pointed to a table in the corner. He sat stiffly, as if the place were made of barbed wire, while she made a cup of coffee. When she sat down across from him, she placed her coffee on the table and waited. Ethan finally broke the silence. "I have a proposal for you." Her expression changed to wary. "Proposal?" He hesitated, but continued. "I need someone to accompany me to Christmas events and a family dinner. Something purely professional. In return, I can help financially with any difficulties you are facing." Charlotte blinked in disbelief. "Do you want me to pretend to be your escort?" Ethan shook his head. "For a short period, it would be advantageous for both of us." Nervous laughter escaped Charlotte before she could stop herself. "Do you know how absurd that sounds?" Ethan leaned forward, eyes intense. "What do you have to lose?" She fell silent, the words echoing in her mind. He was right. The bakery was hanging by a thread, and the idea of asking someone like him for help seemed hopeless, but maybe it was the only chance she had. Charlotte took a deep breath, her mind reeling with the risks and possibilities. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice weaker than she intended. As Ethan left, she stared at the door, feeling like she was in the middle of an intersection, with all the signs pointing in conflicting directions. Snow continued to fall in Chicago, covering the city in a shimmering white blanket as the clock ticked down to the start of another day. Charlotte was standing in the doorway of her bakery, wrapping her scarf around her neck. In his hand, he held an envelope, but it wasn't for overdue bills. It was the contract Ethan Carter had sent the night before. She had read each line at least 3 times, feeling like a stranger in her own life. The paper seemed heavy, loaded with the expectations and implications it brought. It was simple. She would pretend to be Ethan's +1 at family events and gatherings until Christmas. In return, he would not only pay his debts, but also finance the renovation of the bakery. His eyes ran over the words again. It was rational, but it seemed crazy. Charlotte never imagined she would put her life in such an absurd situation. Still, the images of the eviction sign and the empty building where her parents had once built dreams continued to haunt her. Sighing, she looked up at the gray sky and closed the door, leaving the envelope on the counter. It was time to open the bakery, but his mind was elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Ethan's office, he stared at his phone as if he could force Charlotte's response with the power of thought. He knew the proposal was bold, perhaps even arrogant, but he also knew it was his best option. His family had become unbearable, especially his stepmother, who loved to point out his lack of emotional commitment. Ethan knew his life was full of holes. The void left by his younger brother, which he never admitted to anyone, weighed on him at times like these. He didn't have the time or patience for genuine connections, but he needed Charlotte to accept it. Not for her, but for him. The phone notification vibrated. Ethan quickly picked up the device, but hesitated before opening the message. It was from Charlotte. "I accept, but on one condition. We need to set clear boundaries." Ethan smiled to himself, a smile that mixed relief and a touch of defiance. He knew Charlotte was different, but he was willing to deal with any resistance she offered. Hours later, they were sitting in the corner of an upscale cafe in downtown Chicago. Christmas music played softly in the background, and the roaring fireplace cast dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Charlotte held a cup of hot tea, feeling the comforting warmth in her hands as she eyed Ethan warily. He was relaxed, as if he was completely in control of the situation. "Before anything else," she said, "I need to know that this will not interfere with my life beyond what was agreed. I have a bakery to run." Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on her. "Of course. You set the terms of what is comfortable for you." Charlotte raised an eyebrow. "And are you comfortable with that?" He smirked. "I am a man who solves problems. If setting boundaries is what you need, then let's do it." But while Ethan spoke calmly, inside he felt something different. Charlotte was direct, unafraid to regard him as an equal. There was no flattery, no attempt to impress him. He found himself admiring the way she held her head high, even with all the difficulties she faced. Charlotte, in turn, felt uncomfortable with Ethan being so controlled. He seemed cold, almost calculating, but there was something in his eyes that suggested hidden layers. She wondered what had led him to this absurd proposal. After establishing the limits, both signed the contract. Ethan reached out his hand to shake hers, but Charlotte hesitated for a moment before accepting. The touch of his hand was firm, but there was a lightness that surprised her. "We're in this together now," Ethan said. Charlotte responded with a small wave. Little did she know that this deal would change not just her bakery, but her entire outlook on what it meant to trust another person. The room glowed with an elegance that bordered on exaggeration, with sparkling chandeliers hanging over tables covered in white linen tablecloths. The soft sounds of an orchestra playing Christmas carols echoed through the room, accompanied by the murmur of conversation and laughter from Chicago's elite. Charlotte Moore looked around uncomfortably, her eyes taking in every detail of her surroundings that seemed to scream, "You don't belong here." She straightened the dark blue dress Ethan had sent her, still feeling the soft, expensive fabric press against her skin like a constant reminder of where she was. When Ethan appeared at her side, impeccable in a black suit, she sat up straighter, trying to ignore the sudden heat that crept up the back of her neck. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice low and firm. Charlotte turned her head, meeting Ethan's gaze. She was filled with curiosity and something that seemed almost worry. "I'm fine," she replied, although her tone wasn't as convincing as she would have liked. Ethan noticed the hesitation. He knew bringing her to this charity event would be a test, not just for her, but for him too. Despite his cold facade, he felt a wave of silent anxiety. He wasn't sure why he was worried about how Charlotte was feeling, but he couldn't ignore it. "Remember," he said, moving slightly closer, "you are here because I chose you. That means something." The words sounded more intimate than Ethan intended, and Charlotte raised her eyebrows in surprise. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, feeling the weight of his presence beside her as they walked across the room together. The next few hours were a blur of introductions and superficial conversations. Charlotte smiled politely at people who appraised her with curious looks, as if they were trying to fit her into some standard that she obviously didn't meet. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed to glide through the room with disconcerting ease, his unwavering confidence like armor that no one dared penetrate. At one point, while Ethan was talking to a group of businessmen, Charlotte found herself next to an older woman who was holding a glass of wine with an elegance that only time could teach. "So you're Ethan's new companion," the woman said, with a smile that seemed more sharp than friendly. Charlotte smiled back, feeling the tension in every muscle in her body. "Something like that," he replied, trying to sound casual. The woman tilted her head, assessing her with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. "He never brings anyone to events like this. There must be something special about you." The words, although seemingly harmless, made Charlotte feel like she was being tested. She wanted to respond with a witty line, but before she could, Ethan appeared at her side, placing a light hand on her back. "Can I steal my companion?" he asked the woman, with a smile that seemed almost genuine. "Of course, dear," the woman replied, stepping back gracefully. Ethan guided her to a quieter area of the room, where the lights were softer and the people were fewer. "You're doing great," he said, leaning in so only she could hear him. Charlotte let out a short laugh, well enough to keep them from kicking me out at least. Ethan looked at her for a moment, something in his eyes changing. It wasn't judgment or analysis, but something deeper. "Charlotte, You don't need to prove anything to anyone here. They don't know anything about you." She blinked, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. For an instant, she saw something different in him. Not the calculating man who proposed the contract, but someone who carried his own vulnerabilities, hidden well beneath the surface. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer. "Why? For telling me that." Ethan didn't respond. He just looked away, as if he had revealed more than he intended. That night, as they drove back into town in Ethan's car, the silence between them was comfortable in an unexpected way. Charlotte looked out the window, watching the Christmas lights twinkling in the store windows as she reflected on what she had learned. Ethan was more complicated than she thought, and there was something about his seriousness that made her want to know more. Ethan, on the other hand, was torn. He had brought Charlotte to a social function as a professional arrangement, but something about the way she faced that environment, with quiet strength and disarming honesty, moved him in a way he didn't fully understand. When they arrived at the bakery, Charlotte turned to him before getting out of the car. "Ethan, why do you hate Christmas?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, he froze. "It's a long story," he said finally, looking away. "I have time," Charlotte replied, but she knew she wouldn't have an answer that night. As she got out of the car and disappeared into the bakery, Ethan sat in silence, staring at the snow falling outside the window. He knew that eventually he would have to tell the truth, but not yet. Charlotte watched the snow fall while holding a piece of paper in her hands. It was a simple list with items needed to prepare the bakery's Christmas orders, but for some reason, she couldn't concentrate. The list fluttered between his fingers, and his mind was far away, stuck on Ethan's unspoken words from the night before. He seemed so distant when she asked about Christmas, as if the very act of thinking about it was painful. Charlotte knew there was something deep and dark behind that controlled facade, and it intrigued her more than she cared to admit. With a sigh, she folded the paper and stuffed it into her apron pocket. The sweet smell of cinnamon and ginger filled the bakery, but the comfort that normally came with that scent seemed distant. Across town, Ethan was in his conference room, staring at a presentation projected on the wall. He listened to his manager's words, but his mind was also somewhere else. Charlotte's words echoed in her head. "Why do you hate Christmas?" He closed his eyes for a moment, as if he could shake off the question. It wasn't something he could simply explain. Christmas was a constant reminder of what he had lost, of his younger brother Sam, who died in an accident on Christmas Eve years ago. Ethan had blamed himself for it ever since. He was just 17 at the time, but the pain was as raw now as it was then. And then there was Charlotte. She was like a gravitational force he couldn't ignore. There was something about the way she challenged him, as if she saw through his carefully constructed layers. Later that day, Charlotte and Ethan met at a corporate event, a charity lunch organized by his company. Charlotte wore a simple green dress, and her presence seemed to light up the room in a way that Ethan couldn't ignore. He approached her as she eyed a table of desserts decorated with sugar pine trees. "You're doing really well at these events," he said, with a smile that seemed almost genuine. Charlotte looked at him, tilting her head slightly. "And what exactly does this mean?" "It means you are good at dealing with people who like to judge." She laughed softly, but there was something in her expression that made him realize she was thinking about something more. "And you?" she asked, changing the subject. "How do you manage all of this without going crazy?" Ethan hesitated for a moment. "I separate things. I don't let my personal life interfere with work." Charlotte frowned. "This feels lonely." Before he could respond, Ethan's mother, accompanied by his stepmother, approached. They were impeccable, with smiles that were more formality than warmth. "Ah, so this is Charlotte," said her mother, assessing her with discerning eyes. "Ethan told us a lot about you." Ethan narrowed his eyes at his mother, but Charlotte smiled politely. "I hope it was something good," he replied, feeling uncomfortable under that scrutiny. "It was intriguing," replied the stepmother, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The conversation was short, but it left Charlotte with a knot in her stomach. She felt like she had gone through an invisible assessment and somehow hadn't met the standard. When they pulled away, she looked at Ethan. "That was Weird, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. That's how they are. Don't let it affect you. But Charlotte knew something else was going on. She felt like there was an invisible weight pressing down on Ethan, something he refused to share. That night, as Ethan drove her back to the bakery, the silence in the car was thick. Charlotte looked out the window, but she couldn't help but want to break the silence. "Ethan, why did you really choose me for this?" she asked finally. He remained silent for a moment before responding. "Because you are different. You don't try to be something you're not." She turned to him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "That is good?" Ethan stopped the car in front of the bakery and looked her straight in the eyes. "Yes, it's good. It's rare." Charlotte felt her heart quicken, but before she could respond, he looked away. "Good evening, Charlotte," he said, his voice back to its controlled tone. As she got out of the car and walked into the bakery, she felt confused. There was something changing between them, something she didn't know if she was ready to face. The soft sound of the bakery doorbells announced Ethan's arrival. Charlotte was in the kitchen, but she heard the noise and appeared, wiping her hands on her flour-stained apron. She stopped mid-motion when she saw him, dressed impeccably, but with an oddly vulnerable expression. "Ethan, what are you doing here? It's not one of the events, is it?" He shook his head, stuffing his hands into his coat pockets. "No, I just needed to talk to you." Charlotte frowned, slowly approaching. Something in his tone warned her that this was no simple visit. She pointed to one of the tables. "Sit down. Do you want coffee?" He nodded, and Charlotte prepared 2 cups, placing them on the table before sitting down across from him. The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the sound of the wind outside, howling against the windows. Finally, Ethan spoke. "There was something you asked the other day about Christmas." Charlotte tilted her head, surprised that he would bring this up. "Yes, I remember." You never responded. He took a deep breath, looking at the smoke rising from his cup. "It's not an easy answer." She waited, watching as he seemed to struggle with invisible words. Ethan wasn't the type of person to show vulnerability, but in that moment, there was something broken in his posture, as if he were carrying a weight that was finally starting to slip off his shoulders. "When I was 17, he began, my family was different. My younger brother, Sam, was the person who brought us all together. He loved Christmas. It was the best time of the year because of him." Charlotte was silent, but her heart sank at the mention of a brother. The way he said the name was full of love and pain at the same time. "On Christmas Eve that year," he continued, "I was in a hurry. I had other plans, other places to go. He wanted me to stay and play video games with him, but I said I couldn't. And while I was gone," Ethan stopped, his voice cracking. Charlotte held her breath, feeling the tension of the moment. "There was an accident," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sam was playing near the stairs. He fell." Charlotte brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Ethan, I'm so sorry." He raised his hand, stopping her. "That's my fault. If I had been there, maybe I could have stopped him. Maybe he was still here." The room fell silent again. Charlotte didn't know what to say. Ethan's words were filled with years of pain and regret, and she knew no amount of comfort could erase it. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft. "You can't carry this alone, Ethan. It wasn't your fault." He laughed humorlessly, shaking his head. "Everyone says that, but it doesn't change how I feel." Charlotte hesitated for a moment before reaching across the table, lightly touching his hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried a silent promise of understanding and support. "You need to find a way to forgive yourself," she said, looking straight into his eyes. Ethan looked at his hands, at her touch, and something inside him seemed to soften. He didn't answer, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like it might be possible. Later that night, Charlotte was alone in the bakery's kitchen, her emotions still roiling from her conversation with Ethan. She had never seen that side of him before, so raw and human. Despite everything, she felt a deep desire to help him find peace. Meanwhile, Ethan was in his penthouse, looking out at the city lights. He held a small Christmas ornament that Sam had made years ago, a clumsy snowman with crooked eyes, but one that had been his brother's favorite. For the first time in years, he didn't put it back in the box. Snow continued to fall in Chicago, covering the city in a fresh layer of white. It was Christmas Eve, and while the city seemed to warm up with the lights in the windows and the music echoing through the streets. Charlotte felt a strange cold in her chest. The conversation with Ethan a few days ago still weighed on his mind. There was something about the way he looked at her, with so much desperation masked by a facade of control, that made her uneasy. That morning, she decided to do something about it. The bakery was closed for the holidays, so she sat in her small living room with a photo album on her lap. The images from his childhood were there, all telling stories of a time that seemed so far away now. Her parents, with warm smiles and hands covered in flour, appeared in several photos alongside her and another child, a younger boy, with messy hair and a mischievous smile. Charlotte ran her fingers over the photo, feeling a pang of longing. It had been so long since she thought about him. Josh, her younger brother, had disappeared when she was 14. It was a blow that tore his family apart and left wounds that never completely healed. His parents had spent years searching for him, each lead leading to dead ends until finally, silence took over. They never knew what happened, and Charlotte grew up carrying the pain of an absence that was never explained. She closed the album with a sigh, feeling tears threatening to fall. Maybe that was why she understood Ethan in a way he didn't even realize. The loss, the regret, the weight of carrying memories that seemed to live and breathe inside you. It was all part of it too. Ethan was sitting on his penthouse, looking at the box of Christmas decorations he hadn't touched in years. Each piece seemed to carry the weight of memories he would rather forget. But this time, something made him stop. He picked up the snowman Sam had made when he was 6 and held it in his hands. Charlotte was right. He knew he needed to let the past go, but how? His thoughts were interrupted by a message on his phone. It was from Charlotte. "Come to the bakery tonight. I need to show you something." Hours later, Ethan entered the bakery. The place was dark, except for a single light over the counter and the Christmas tree lights in the windows. Charlotte was there, waiting, with the same album on her lap. "I almost gave up waiting for you," she said with a shy smile, "but something told me you would come." Ethan frowned, intrigued. "What is happening?" Charlotte didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened the album and turned it so he could see. "This is my family," she said, pointing to the photos. He looked at the images, seeing the happy faces and moments captured. Then, his expression changed when he saw a particular photo. It was of a boy, about 6 or 7 years old, with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. "This is my brother Josh," Charlotte said, her voice softening. "He disappeared when I was 14. Ethan's eyes widened, a chill running down his spine. That face, there was something familiar about it, something he couldn't ignore. Charlotte continued, "I spent most of my life wondering what happened to him, blaming me, like you blame yourself for your brother." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a wave of emotions collide inside him, but what she said next left him paralyzed. "I did some research recently, just to try and find out more. I found something that can connect our stories." She took a piece of paper from inside the album and handed it to him. It was an old newspaper clipping with a headline that said, "Missing child found in emergency shelter." The date was close to the time Ethan remembered Sam's accident. Ethan read the words, feeling the blood drain from his face. "This can't be." Charlotte looked at him, her face a mix of hope and fear. "Ethan, do you remember anything about what happened to Sam after he fell?" He shook his head, trying to piece it together. "He was taken to the hospital, but then..." Charlotte held his hand, her voice shaking. "Ethan, I think Sam may have been taken to a shelter, and for some reason, he may never have come back to you." Ethan looked at her, his mind spinning. The idea was unbearable, and at the same time, it made a strange kind of sense. If that was true, then everything he believed about that night was wrong. The silence between them was thick, filled with unanswered questions. Charlotte looked at him with tears in her eyes. Maybe the past we're trying to escape isn't exactly what we think it is. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling her words hit him hard. For the first time, he realized that the truth could be more complicated and more hopeful than the weight he was carrying. Ethan woke up with the first rays of sun invading his coverage. He hadn't slept well. The conversation with Charlotte the night before echoed in his mind like a song that he couldn't turn off. Sam's face in the picture, Charlotte's words, and the possibility that everything he believed about the past was wrong left him in a state of restlessness. He got up slowly, The snowman Sam had done was still at the table beside the couch, where he had left him the night before. Caught him in his hands was like playing a wound he never healed. He held the object for a moment, the emotional weight crushing his chest. If Charlotte was right, if Sam had survived and somehow was lost in the system, then Ethan had not only lost years of his life to blame himself, but also let his brother face it alone. The pain was unbearable, but he was mixed with a spark of hope that he was afraid to allow to grow. Charlotte also spent a busy night, reviewing every detail of the conversation and the tracks that connected them. The possibility that Ethan could meet Sam to fill with a strange mix of anxiety and expectation. She caught herself looking at Josh's photo again, the familiarity of his features and Sam creating a web of confused feelings. In the morning she was in the bakery, but her focus was far from her usual tasks. The smell of fresh bread and coffee usually comforted her, but that day looked just a distraction. When Ethan entered, without notice, she immediately knew that he had also been a difficult night. He approached her, and the silence between them seemed heavier than ever. Finally, he said, his low voice full of emotion, "We need to find out the truth." Charlotte nodded. "I thought the same thing." The rest of the day was a whirlwind of search and phone calls. Together, they scoured files online, called hospitals and old shelters, and revisited any clue that could connect them to Sam's whereabouts. Charlotte, with her ability to remain calm under pressure, managed to lead the effort, while Ethan fought the whirlwind of emotions that consumed him. In one point he stopped, rubbing his face with his hands. What if we are wrong? What if he's not alive? Charlotte stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Ethan, even if we are wrong, at least we will be doing something. You spent years carrying it alone. Now you don't need it anymore." He stared at her for a moment, his words hitting him deeply. For the first time, he felt he was not fighting alone. As the hours passed, a track finally emerged. One of the shelters where Charlotte believed Josh could have gone, also in the records of a hospital that Ethan had previously contacted. The connections were fragile, but enough to rekindle their hopes. They decided to visit the place together. While driving through the streets of Chicago, the silence in the car was different this time, not loaded with discomfort, but of a mutual understanding. When they arrived at the shelter, they were greeted by an older woman with a kind smile. Ethan explained the situation carefully, and Charlotte showed the old photos of Sam and Josh. The woman frowned, analyzing the images. "I remember this boy," she said finally, pointing to Sam. "He stayed here for a while, but was placed on an adoption program shortly after." Ethan's heart jumped. "Is he alive?" The woman nodded, smiling. "As far as I know, yes. He was adopted by a family within the state." Charlotte felt the tears climb to her eyes as Ethan seemed to freeze, trying to process the information. The woman gave them the family name and an address. The return to Chicago was silent again, but this time the silence was full of meaning. Ethan held the piece of paper with the address as if it were the most precious object in the world. Charlotte watched him from Sisleo, feeling a mixture of relief and nervousness. She wanted Ethan to find Sam, but she also knew the journey would not end there. There was a lot to be resolved among them, and she wondered if he would be able to face everything. When they arrived in front of the bakery, Ethan finally spoke. "I don't know how to thank you for it." Charlotte smiled softly. "It is not necessary." He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to say something else, but couldn't find the words. "Good night, Charlotte," he said finally, his voice loaded with emotion. She watched him leave, feeling a strange feeling of emptiness as his car disappeared at night. Ethan's car slid down the snow-covered road, the headlights illuminating the flakes that fell incessantly from the sky. Charlotte was by her side in silence, but her mind was so full of thoughts that she seemed impossible to organize them. Ethan's anxiety was almost palpable in the air, and she could feel his hands by squeezing the steering wheel tightly. The address they had received from the shelter led them to a house in a peaceful and welcoming suburb, decorated with Christmas lights. The trees were adorned with bright stars, and the distant sound of children playing in the snow gave the place an air of serenity. It was hard to associate that quiet scene with the whirlwind of emotions that Ethan and Charlotte carried. When they parked, Ethan remained sitting for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the front door of the house. Charlotte gently put his hand on his arm, feeling the subtle tremor under his skin. "You can, Ethan," she said, her soft but firm voice. He took a deep breath, his eyes finally finding hers. "There are so many things that can go wrong," he murmured. "What if he doesn't want to see me? What if he doesn't remember me?" Charlotte squeezed his arm slightly. "Then you will know you tried. And that's what matters." Ethan nodded, taking courage from her words. He got out of the car, adjusting the coat against the cold wind, and Charlotte followed him closely. Each step toward the door seemed a monumental effort, and the short distance seemed an eternity. The sound of the bell echoed around the house. There was a moment of silence before hurried steps were heard, and the door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with a welcoming smile. "Hello," he said, looking at both of them with curiosity. "Can I help them?" Ethan cleaned his throat, feeling the weight of the words he was about to say. "My name is Ethan Carter. I'm looking for someone named Sam." The man's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of surprise. "Do you mean Sam, our son?" Charlotte arrested her breath to hear that. It was true. "Yes," Ethan answered, his voice shaking slightly. "He is my brother." The man looked at Ethan for a long moment before opening the door more and calling for someone. "Helen, come here." A woman appeared, with gray hair and a kind look. When she saw Ethan, something on her face changed, a silent recognition, as if the pieces of a puzzle are finally fitting. "You are Sam's brother," she said, more as a statement than a question. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. Minutes later, they were sitting in the living room of the house, surrounded by a cozy Christmas decoration. The Christmas tree shone with colorful lights, and the smell of newly baked cookies filled the air. Helen and her husband explained that Sam had been adopted by them when he was about 7 years old. "He had difficulty adapting at first," Helen said. His voice died with sadness. "He didn't remember much of what happened before, but he talked about you, Ethan. Always from you." Ethan swallowed hard, feeling an overwhelming mixture of guilt and relief. He never forgot him, even when Helen put her hand over his. "You did the best you could. And Sam, he's happy now. Where is he?" Ethan asked, his low but urgent voice. "He is coming back from work," he said, Helen's husband. "He must arrive at any moment." The weight was almost unbearable. Charlotte watched Ethan carefully, seeing how he fought against the emotions he threatened to overflow. She wanted to say something, but there were no words that could relieve the weight of that moment. The sound of a car parked outside warned them. Helen got up quickly, heading for the door. When she opened it, a young man entered, shaking the snow from the coat. He was about 25 years old, with light brown hair and eyes that reflected the same intensity as Ethan. Ethan got up, unable to take his eyes off him. "Sam?" The young man stopped, his eyes wide up when he heard the name. "Yes, it's me, Ethan," he said, his voice failing. "Your brother." For a moment, the silence took over the room. Then slowly a smile formed on Sam's lips, and he stepped forward. "Ethan, is it really you?" The two hugged each other, and Charlotte felt the tears running down her face as she watched the scene. The connection between them was undeniable, and the reunion seemed something taken from a Christmas miracle. Later, while Ethan and Sam talked and shared memories, Charlotte walked away to the porch, needing a moment to soothe everything. She looked at the starry sky, feeling a mixture of joy and melancholy. Ethan appeared shortly thereafter, closing the door softly behind him. "Thanks for it," he said, his voice full of emotion. "I would never have done this without you." She smiled, though her heart hit hard. "I'm glad it worked." Ethan looked at her, the weak light of the stars illuminating her face. "Charlotte, Before he could end, she shook her head. "Ethan, you need time. This moment is about you and Sam." He hesitated, but then nodded, understanding. But as he went back, something between them had changed. The snow still fell gently in Chicago, covering the streets with a quiet whiteness that seemed to end the chaos of the world for a moment. Charlotte's bakery was lit, with garlands and lights flashing, framing the windows, reflecting a warm shine on the damp sidewalk. Inside, the sweet smell of ginger and cinnamon cookies filled the air, mixed with the sound of laughter and voices. Ethan was sitting on one table near the window, a cup of hot chocolate between his hands. He was looking at Charlotte as she served the last customers of the day, her flour-covered apron and the cheeks blocked by the oven's heat. Each movement was natural, graceful, and he realized it wasn't just the bakery that shone that night. It was her. Ethan had spent her last days alongside Sam, sharing stories, reconstructing a connection he thought was losing forever. But even with all the joy of that reunion, there was something that pulled him back to Charlotte. It was as if it were the center of an invisible wire that kept him anchored, not just the present, but to a future he still didn't know he wanted. When the last client came out, Charlotte closed the door, locking it and turning off the sign. She turned to Ethan, who was still sitting, watching her with an intensity that made her stop for a moment. "What are you waiting for?" she asked with a playful smile. Ethan stood slowly, his coat still thrown over the back of the chair. "I'm waiting for you to tell me it's time to go," he said. But his voice had a different tone, something deeper, almost hesitant. Charlotte took the apron, hanging it in a hook near the counter. "Well, I think it depends. Is there anything more than you want?" Ethan stepped toward her, the short distance between them decreasing rapidly. "I want to know what you want, Charlotte." The words hovered in the air, and Charlotte felt her heart accelerate. She looked away for a moment, too busy with the emotions she climbed like a tide inside her. "You just found your brother, Ethan. This is huge." "I don't want you," he interrupted her, her voice firm, but full of emotion. "I know what I want. It's not something I need more time to understand." Charlotte looked at him, seeing the truth in his eyes. She wanted to believe it, but fear was holding her. "What if this is just a reaction? You went through so much." Ethan took another step, until she was so close that she could feel the warmth of her presence. "It is not a reaction. And you, from the beginning, you made me feel something I hadn't felt for years." Charlotte tried to answer, but the words got stuck in her throat. He continued, the intensity in his voice growing. "You brought me back, Charlotte. You made me face my fears, my past. And now, all I want is to be where you are." She felt the tears rose in her eyes, and before she could contain herself, one escaped, running down her cheek. Ethan lifted his hand, cleaning her gently with her thumb. "I'm not perfect," she said, her trembling voice. "I also carry things." "Then we carried together," he answered, a soft smile touching his lips. That moment seemed to extend through eternity. And then, without saying anything else, Ethan leaned and kissed her. It was a kiss full of everything that had passed: pain, loss, hope, and above all, a deep relief from finally found something they didn't know were looking for. When they broke up, Charlotte took a deep breath, still trying to soothe everything. "You know I'm stubborn, right?" "I already realized," said Ethan, smiling. "And also that the bakery comes first." He laughed, a genuine and light sound that she realized she loved, always. Later that night, as they walked down the snow-covered street, Charlotte looked at Ethan, who held his hand firmly, but with a touch that seemed to say that he would never solve her. "Are you going to stay here?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He stopped, turning to look into her eyes. "Charlotte, I won't go anywhere." She smiled, feeling something inside her finally calm down. The snow fell around them, the flakes shining in the light of the posts. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt that Christmas had given him more than memories, had given him a future.